Behind the iron railings of Buckingham Palace, a royal guard broke protocol for the first time in his life. Why? A desperate signal from a small child in the crowd, one that only he recognized. And the decision he made in that moment changed 2 lives forever. Where are you watching this story from? Let us know in the comments and subscribe to our channel for more stories of everyday heroes. As summer heat rose from the cobblestones surrounding Buckingham Palace, tourists gathered around barriers to watch the iconic changing of the guard ceremony. Staff Sergeant James Harrington stood with perfect attention, sunlight reflecting off his brass buttons. 6 years of service in the Royal Regiment had taught Harrington to maintain absolute stillness while remaining completely alert, a skill that had saved his life during his 2 tours in Afghanistan and now served him equally well on palace duty. Among the sea of excited faces, 9-year-old Oliver Matthews stood unnaturally still, his small hand tightly held by his stepfather, Mark Jennings. Unlike other children bouncing with excitement, Oliver's posture was rigid, his eyes darting nervously between the guards and his stepfather. "Stand up straight," Mark muttered, yanking Oliver's arm sharply. "And remember what I told you?" Oliver nodded quickly, wincing as Mark's fingers dug into his shoulder. Despite the warm day, he wore a long-sleeved shirt that completely covered his arms, an odd choice that drew curious glances from nearby tourists. Harrington noticed him immediately, not because he stood out, but because his stillness amid the excited crowd triggered the same instincts that had kept the sergeant alive in combat. The guard's peripheral vision caught the contradiction between the boy's curious eyes and rigid posture, his calculation of every movement before making it. As the ceremony progressed, Harrington maintained the perfect ceremonial order while keeping the boy and his stepfather in his peripheral vision. The contrast between them became more pronounced with each passing minute. The man's confident, almost arrogant demeanor against the child's careful, measured movements. Mark leaned down to whisper something in Oliver's ear. While his expression remained pleasant to those around, the color drained from Oliver's face. When Harrington executed a perfect turn, Mark and Oliver again entered his line of sight. Mark bent down, adjusting Oliver's collar. The motion pulled the child's sleeve up enough to reveal distinct bruises on his upper arm, the unmistakable pattern of finger marks from an adult's grip applied with excessive force. A middle-aged couple standing nearby noticed it too. The woman's hand flew to her mouth, and she whispered something to her husband, who frowned deeply at Mark. "Nice ceremony, isn't it?" said the husband pointedly, addressing Mark while his wife smiled at Oliver. "Your son seems quite impressed by it all." Mark's jaw visibly tightened. "He's not really into these things," he responded curtly. "Just killing time until our tour." As ceremonial drums echoed across the palace grounds, the changing of the guard reached its most critical moment. Tourists raised their phones even higher, eager to capture the perfect image of British tradition. But Staff Sergeant Harrington's attention was focused on the small boy standing just 3 meters from his position. When Mark was momentarily distracted by someone bumping into him from behind, Oliver seized his opportunity. With deliberate, practiced movements that no 9-year-old should ever have to learn, Oliver raised his small hand to his face. To ordinary observers, he might have been waving or brushing hair from his eyes. But to Harrington, who had received the same mandatory training as all service personnel who work with the public, the movement was unmistakable. His little fist opened and closed, then pressed into his palm. The Universal Children's Distress Signal, taught in schools and child protection programs nationwide. "Help me, I'm in danger." Harrington's combat-trained mind registered the signal instantly, cataloging it alongside the bruises, the controlled fear, the stepfather's threatening behavior, all forming a clear picture of a child in immediate danger. For 6 years, Staff Sergeant James Harrington had stood guard with impeccable, unwavering discipline. Through rain and snow, tourist jokes and provocations, physical discomfort, and mental fatigue, he had maintained the ceremonial stillness that defines the Royal Guard. Now, in the space between one heartbeat and the next, Harrington made the decision that would forever change both his life and Oliver's. When Harrington broke formation, the crowd audibly gasped. The sound of his boots striking the stone pathway echoed in the sudden silence as tourists lowered their cameras in astonishment. His movements were precise, purposeful, not the actions of someone breaking protocol on a whim, but of a soldier responding to a threat with tactical precision. Mark froze mid-step, still holding Oliver, when he realized the guard was moving directly toward them with unmistakable purpose. The crowd naturally parted, creating a clear path between Harrington and his target. "I'm going to ask you to release the child, sir," Harrington's voice carried the weight of military authority, cutting through the murmurs of the bewildered crowd. Mark's expression rapidly cycled through shock, anger, and calculation. He loosened his grip on Oliver slightly, but didn't let go. "This is my son," he said, forcing out a bewildered laugh. "We're just leaving to catch our tour bus." Two palace security officers had noticed the commotion and were advancing toward them, quietly speaking into their radios. The crowd had formed a loose circle around the scene, most recording with their phones despite the unsettling tension. Oliver looked up at Harrington, years of conditioning battling with hope of rescue. "He hurts me," he whispered, the words tumbling out in a rush before fear could silence him again. "Please don't let him take me home." The security officers arrived, and within minutes, the Metropolitan Police were called. Mark Jennings, it turned out, wasn't even Oliver's legal guardian. He was the boyfriend of Oliver's aunt, who had taken temporary custody after his mother's hospitalization. The aunt had reported Oliver missing 3 days earlier, but Mark had convinced the boy that no one was looking for him. The officers took Mark away in handcuffs. As evidence of previous abuse became clear, Oliver was taken to a safe room within the palace grounds where social services were called. Child protection specialists arrived, documenting the bruises and taking Oliver's statement. All the while, Staff Sergeant Harrington stayed nearby, having been relieved of his duties for the day by an understanding commanding officer who recognized the extraordinary circumstances. 3 hours later, after the paperwork was completed and arrangements made for Oliver to be reunited with his recovering mother at her sister's home, Staff Sergeant Harrington walked side by side with Oliver from the palace gates. His ceremonial uniform had been exchanged for civilian clothes, but his military bearing remained unmistakably the same. "Ready to go home?" he asked, extending his hand. Home, now meaning the safe place where Oliver's mother and supportive aunt were waiting, far from Mark's cruelty. Oliver slid his small hand into his. "Home," he repeated, testing the word and finding it finally contained no fear. "Yes, I'm ready." Would you break the rules to protect someone vulnerable? Do you know the signals children use to ask for help? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you, please like and subscribe to our channel for more stories that remind us what true courage looks like in everyday moments.